Good morning, all. As Professor Stephen W. Hawking said, quote, disability need not be an obstacle to success. I have had motor neuron disease for practically all my adult life. Yet, it has not prevented me from having a prominent career in astrophysics and a happy family life. Unquote. More than 1 billion people in the world live with some form of disability, of whom nearly 200 million experience considerable difficulties in functioning. In the years ahead, disability has become a greater concern because its prevalence is on the rise. This is due to aging populations and the higher risk of disability in older people, as well as the global increase in the chronic health conditions such as diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, cancer, and mental health disorders. In the 11th session of our International Faculty Development Program on Changing Paradigms of Human Rights, the entire analysis of the human rights has shown that across the world, people with disabilities have poorer health outcomes, lower education achievements, less economic participation, and higher rates of poverty than people without disabilities. This is partly because with disabilities, they experience barriers in accessing services that many of us have long taken for granted, including health, education, employment, transport, as well as information, which all have become a part and paradigm of the human rights. Therefore, this sensitive topic by the Faculty of Law has been taken, and it has been honored to be dealt with the person who is dealing it in practicality, Miss Anna Clements. Thank you, ma'am. She
Thank you
is
so
a
much.
social policy researcher and a PhD candidate at the Heller School for Social Policy at Brandeis University in Boston, USA. She is currently drafting recommendations for the US Congress on improving legislations protecting people with disabilities from gender-based violence and abuse. For the past year, Anna has coordinated the Disability Working Group at her university, helping graduate students with disabilities to access the learning accommodations they need. In her personal research, she is focusing on the intersections of racism and ableism in the school to prison pipeline. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us. And it's all yours. The stage is all yours. Kindly conduct the session.
Much. I'm so happy to be here, and please, everyone, if you have questions anytime, even if I'm talking, please type them into the chat. I am more than happy to pause this to answer questions because I want to make sure that this is as accessible and inclusive as possible. As the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities motto states, nothing about us without us. So I'd like to introduce myself personally. Aside from that lovely introduction to my professional life, I also am a person with an acquired cognitive disability. When I was 16 years old, I was in a car accident and my head was hit very hard by a truck, and so my brain has been injured for the past, I won't say how many years, but I've lived most of my life with this acquired cognitive disability, and so when I talk about disability, I'm talking about people with disabilities as a group. I'm talking about research on people with disabilities as a group internationally, but I'm also talking about a community that I myself am a part of. So I think it is very important to own our own experiences with disability. And disability is also something that people can experience at different times in their lives. So you might be born with a disability, you might be born without a disability, but at any time of your life you can acquire a disability. As you age, it's more common, it's more prevalent as people age. So before I begin, I just want to clarify that disability is something that is both common, prevalent, but also that anyone can experience in their lives. So what I will be discussing today is the intersection of disability and race or ethnicity. I know that the racial and ethnic issues are different in the United States and in India, but there are a lot of parallels. Both countries have legal systems to counteract the racism, the ethnocentrism, the casteism. There's reservations in India, there's affirmative action in the United States. There are various ways in which laws try to make both nations less racist, more equal. In the same way, both countries have disability rights provisions in their laws. But I'm going to be looking a little bit into how the anti-racism laws and policies, reservations, could be integrated better with the disability rights provisions. So first I'm going to ask the question, what is disability? And if you have an answer, if you're here watching live, you can enter your answer into the private chat. I'm curious, what do you think disability is? Is disability a condition of the body? Is disability a condition of the mind? Is disability something that is caused by an individual? Is disability bad luck? Is disability something that is created by culture and society? So there are several different models of disability in disability studies. The most prevalent model of disability, these are conceptual models. The most prevalent conceptual model of disability is known as the medical model. The medical model of disability is the idea that a disability is a handicap. A disability is an inherent condition that a person has in their body or in their brain that affects their functioning, affects their ability to move, to work, to think, to focus, to concentrate, to remember, to see, to hear. It's something that is within a person. However, the social model, which emerged more recently, thinks disability is not just something that exists within a person. Disability requires a society to be inaccessible. For instance, if everyone were blind, then the world would be created in a way that was accessible for people without vision. And I see a comment. Yes. Disability can be either mental or physical. And people with disabilities are special in their own ways. And building upon that, comment, very, very good comment. Building upon that, many people with disabilities develop abilities that people without disabilities don't have. For instance, if someone can't see, if someone is blind, often that person's hearing becomes much more attuned. Often their sense of touch becomes much more sensitive, much more attuned. So yes, excellent comment. There are special abilities that people with disabilities often develop. So what about mental health conditions? Is depression a disability? Is bipolar disorder disability? These are questions that vary between jurisprudences, between jurisdictions. They vary country to country, they vary law to law, and even within countries, there are different laws that define disability differently. So the question, what is disability? It sounds straightforward, but it's not that straightforward because isn't there isn't an international agreement, nor is there even an agreement within countries. Within India, there are many different definitions, different conceptions of what disability is. Within the United States, there are many different conceptions. And even within laws, the conception of what constitutes disability changes. The legal definitions of disability in India and in the United States are also not the same. So I'll start with the United States, where I'm based right now. Oh, and I see another comment. A physical condition which consequently hampers the mental health condition of persons suffering from such kind of disability. Do you think that, here's a question back to you. Do you think that all people with disabilities suffer as a result of their disability? Do you think that it is an essential part of disability to suffer? You know, in many of the literature surrounding disability, words like suffering come up. And that's something that is essential to the medical model. Yes, I see the comment. The social circumstances lead them to suffer. Exactly. So, for instance, if someone cannot walk, if someone is in a wheelchair, for instance, or uses a cane, crutches, that person is going to work, but the place of employment has stairs up to it. That person might struggle, might suffer a lot trying to enter this place of work. Is it because of the disability? Or is it because of the stairs? Who has created the suffering and the struggling in that situation? So that's how the social model frames disability, that it's partially the person's physical condition or mental condition, but a much bigger part of it, a much bigger factor in the suffering or in the problem is the social infrastructure, whether it's the physical infrastructure, the built environment, the actual physical stairs, or whether it's the cultural communities that exclude a person for being blind, for having bipolar disorder, for having a cognitive disability, for having a physical disability. Societies are the ones that either include or exclude people. I see a comment. In my opinion, the person suffering from disability acquires additional cognitive abilities to prove themselves. Yes, excellent. So, and that happens with all kinds of disabilities. People with physical disabilities often have to work their minds excessively hard just to figure out how to get around in a society that wasn't built for them. People with cognitive conditions, such as I have a traumatic brain injury, that means that my short-term memory has been damaged. According to an evaluation, I'm in the bottom 7th% of ability to remember things. Therefore, I've developed other abilities to help me to organize the information, to help me to contextualize it so that it's more easily accessible. That's a skill that I've developed because of my disability. Someone who is deaf, that person's vision or other senses will become very good. So exactly what you said, the person will acquire new skills, new abilities to compensate. Yes. So in that way, because of the new skills that a person will necessarily develop to get by in this ableist world. A person does not necessarily have to suffer if those skills are allowed to flourish. So, the legal definitions of disability. In the United States, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And this act, this law, defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. But is that inclusive? Does that include all different forms of disability? And what if, as the last person who commented most aptly noted, if a person who has a disability has developed very keen skills in other areas to compensate for that disability, then that person might not even be aware of the limitations. That person might not be so limited because of her abilities to compensate. So, do you think that this law is inclusive of everyone with disabilities, those who have developed compensatory mechanisms and those who have not been able to? And I'll go to India now. So, India, which, unlike the United States, has been a much greater part of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And just a question for you. How familiar are you with the UNCRPD? Is this something that you've all discussed in classes? Is this something that you're all very familiar with? Because I know here in the United States, very few people are familiar with the UNCRPD. It's something that it's an area where we in the United States are very behind. I had to go to India to learn about it. So if anyone wants to say in the chat, what is your background with the UNCRPD? And I'll go on, but feel free to enter comments. So in India, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016 defines a person with a disability as a person with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which is much more inclusive than the United States ones, which, quote, in interaction with barriers, hinders his full and effective participation in society equal with others. So why do you think I highlighted the clause in interaction with barriers? How does that clause make India's definition different from the United States definition? The United States definition is rooted within the medical model of disability. And remember, the medical model of disability places disability as something that exists within a person. It's a problem with the person's body, a problem with the person's mind. It's a problem with that person's functioning. The social and the rights model of disabilities, they conceptualize disability as something that happens in interaction with the outside world. So disability is not a disability all by itself. A disability has to be a disability based on the barriers that exist outside of a person. So a blind person is only disabled if she exists in a world that's not built for people with limited vision. If the world were structured in a way, if we structured our built environment in a way where we used sounds to indicate how to get around, or where we used smells, scents always to advertise food instead of having visual menus that list the food. If we used all different senses, not just eyes, then not being able to see, would that be a disability? Or if we built our world in a way where information was consistently available, where there were always, anywhere you go, the people who work there, the people, the teachers working in schools, the people, waiters, waitresses working in restaurants, everywhere, if it was part of people's jobs to remind people, if it was part of people's jobs to ask people what they need and respond to those needs, then would cognitive disabilities disable people as much as they do? So these are, of course, rhetorical questions. Please feel free, if you have ideas, if you have any time, please feel free to enter them in the chat. I love the input so far. It's been excellent. Bahut acha. Sorry, my Hindi is not great anymore. But this clause here in the Indian law, which is consistent with the UN CRPD, which states that it's in interaction with barriers, this places the disability in the world around a person, not just within the person herself. This acknowledges that disability is created by society and by the built environment, not just created as a problem within a person. So just this legal definition is revolutionary in and of itself. But there's also something else that this definition does, that acknowledging interaction with barriers, it's not always interpreted right now as doing this, but as we'll see in the next few slides, it could be. We can take it there, and we should. So, but quickly first, I want to talk a little bit about incarcerating people with disabilities. So, when I mention the carceral system, what do you think of? Do you think of a just system that's fair? Do you think of a necessary social system to keep people safe? Well, in the United States, we have a race problem with incarceration. That is to say, there are many ingrained systems of racism that cause people with darker skin to be incarcerated at much higher rates than people with lighter skin in this country, in the United States. That's widely known, that in the United States, there is a race problem in the carceral system, that racism feeds into the carceral system, and that there are many, many people who are locked up in prisons because of racism. But one thing that is less known, but it's been coming out in recent studies over the past 5 years, is that there are many people with disabilities who are incarcerated. So according to a study from 2006 by the US Bureau of Justice Statistics, 38% of state and federal prisoners had at least one disability. So there are many people in the United States who are locked up, and there are many times when a person's disability plays a role in that person being incarcerated. Imagine a person with a mental health disability interacting in public, and there's something that seems different about this person. This person maybe doesn't understand social norms, and so he behaves in a way that's different from other people. The police are going to be watching him more than they're watching other people, and so maybe 10 people in a space commit the same small infraction. Who do you think the police are going to identify? Do you think they're going to identify the small crimes committed by people who don't have that mental disability or cognitive disability or psychosocial disability? Or do you think they're going to identify and punish? Interesting. So I see someone stated that the cultural connect does impair the disabled persons because in India, a mere dark complexion is regarded as a disability for certain societal commitments. Yes. And here too in the United States, yes. So colorism, racism, all of these prejudices compound what disability is, how disability is understood, but also how the legal system responds to people's disabling conditions. So in India, so the statistics are not quite clear. I couldn't find a consistent set of statistics that all state the same thing, but I found that the Hindustan Times reported in 2018 that there were 6,623 people incarcerated who had mental illness. Now, if researchers are counting the number of people incarcerated who have mental illness, how do you think they're going to count the people with mental illness? Do you think they'll do a survey? Ask each person who's incarcerated, do you have mental illness? Do you think they'll ask the prison guards, how many of your prisoners have mental illness? It's the same here in the United States as it is in India, and that is that disability statistics, specifically when it comes to mental and cognitive disabilities, underestimate a time limit frame. So someone commented the Indian definition of disability has a time limit frame, whereas the US definition has no such restriction. Yes, there are certain disabilities that are understood legally to last a person's whole life, and there are other disabilities that are understood to be temporary. So, and someone commented, we really need a solid system by law, and even more even by humanity, where there is no just sympathy towards them, but a rule that can make them stand as equal to all with no sense of mercy. Yes, exactly. Yes. So because statistical methods, because there's still such a stigma around disability, there are many people who have mental health conditions, who have cognitive disabilities, even have more subtle physical disabilities. But if a survey asks them the question, do you have a disability? They'll say no because of the stigma, because people with disabilities are looked down upon still. So the numbers, 38% of people in state and federal prisons in the United States, 6,623 people in India. I would highly doubt that these numbers are accurate, because when they're collecting these numbers, many people will hide their disabilities. And that's for safety. That's because disability everywhere in the world is so stigmatized that it's dangerous to openly state that you have a disability, especially for mental and cognitive disabilities. I have an example. In the United States, I was communicating with a man who's in prison. He is a black-skinned Muslim man who is imprisoned unjustly because of a racist system in the United States. And he has a slight cognitive disability from being hit in the head more than 40 years ago when he was young. And I said to him, well, when you were hit in the head and you were discharged, he was in the army, you were discharged from the army because you were hit in the head, and that affected your memory, and that affected your ability to control your impulses. That's a form of disability. You could bring that up in legal proceedings. But what he said to me was, I'm a black man. They're not going to look kindly upon that. They're going to use that. If I identify as a person with a disability, they're going to use that against me to take away my freedoms, to take away the abilities that I have in this prison. So So that system of racism, that system of using disability, using the concept of disability to limit what a person can do based on who they are, based on the color of their skin, based on who their family is, based on their religion, based on their ethnic background, based on all sorts of oppressed identities, maybe based on their sexual orientation. If disability status can still be used against people in racist ways, in ethnocentric ways, then as long as that's still happening, then the numbers of people with disabilities are going to be underreported. Then people are not going to accurately identify themselves on censuses, on questionnaires, on surveys as people with disabilities. So these are the reasons why the numbers are high, you know? Thousands of people in India are incarcerated. Thousands of people in the United States are incarcerated who have disabilities. Those people should be getting help, not being locked up. But even those numbers are not the real numbers. They're not as high as the actual numbers because it's still dangerous. It's especially dangerous for people who are incarcerated to state openly that they have a disability. So the incarceration of people with disabilities is a problem in the United States. It's a problem in India. It's a problem in most countries in the world, unfortunately. So there are legal protections in place. And in India, I'm sure you know more about this than I do. The Prisoners Act has of 1990 and the Indian Mental Health Act of 1987 both outline guidance for responding to incarcerated people with mental illness. So they both describe ways in which people with mental illness who are incarcerated in the criminal legal system, how they should be treated in ways to accommodate their disabilities. And I'll pause for a second because I'm interested if any of you have any background about these acts, these laws, or and I see a comment or a question. What if people can't respect the differences and only enjoy in the similarities? Do you think this is itself a mental disability of people because this is unnatural? So, are you implying that racism in itself is a disability, or that ethnocentrism in itself is a disability? Because I do think that is it's an interesting set of questions. But I want to turn it back to you and state that, does that mean that human flaws are disabilities? And does that mean that disability is equal to human flaws? Because I think what makes ethnocentrism and racism not the same thing as disabilities is that ethnocentrism, racism, biases against other people, those are poor judgment calls, and those are decisions that people make. A person can change her racist outlook. A person can change her ethnocentric outlook. But a person who is born with a disability cannot choose to be undisabled. So bipolar disorder, I keep using this as an example. My cousin has bipolar disorder, so someone I'm very close to. Racism has been made a disability by certain factors, operative, political, and social. Yes. So, and this goes back to the social and rights model of disabilities, that disability is not something, again, that exists only within a person. That disability is something that is created by the environment, by the society, by the infrastructure, by the laws, by the policies. So, racist policies, those create disabilities in themselves. Yes. So, back to the laws on people who are incarcerated with mental illness. Do you think that these laws, these laws that are there, they're very well intentioned and they're very important? But do you think the laws by themselves are sufficient if there's still so much stigma, especially surrounding mental health disabilities, mental illnesses, those invisible disabilities, with the amount of stigma that still exists globally? Do you think that those laws in themselves are enough? Or do you think that something more is needed to identify mental illness, to accommodate mental illness, so that it's not the responsibility of people themselves who are involved in the criminal legal system to say, oh, also, I have mental illness. Don't forget. Because do you think that people are going to speak up about that? So, how can the system become more kind to people with mental illness, mental health disabilities? So, oh, sorry. So recently, in the past several years, this is an article from 2016, and oops. And this was published in India, and it's looking at the rights of people with disabilities who are incarcerated. Kalpana Kanabiran, please tell me if I'm mispronouncing her name. She wrote this whole article, which I recommend if you're interested, look this up. Are we conscious of the rights of prisoners with disabilities? This is being brought into the discourse. It's something that people are looking into. People are looking into how to make the carceral system less unfriendly, less unfair to people with disabilities. But that's a problem that has been going on for centuries. I've read, I've read works from hundreds of years ago, from the late 1700s, that talk about in Europe, in Asia, not quite in the United States because the United States was still forming then, but there's been written work documenting the injustice of people with disabilities becoming incarcerated because the legal system is inaccessible to them, because there aren't the resources to help them to defend themselves. So this has been discussed for hundreds of years, but now there are scholars, there are legal advocates who are bringing this to society's attention, that if people are incarcerated at higher rates because of their disabilities, or not because of their disabilities, but because of the ableism in the world around them, we need to have stronger legal protections, stronger rights, and stronger public awareness to help prisoners with disabilities and to give people greater access to justice if they have disabilities. So, I have another question. What do you think the role is of race, ethnicity, religion, and caste in incarceration trends among people with disabilities? How do you think that a person's race, a person's skin color, a person's ethnic background, a person's religion, a person's caste, or in the United States, social class, what role do you think those factors play in how the legal system responds to their disability? And I'll give you a few examples, one or two examples, but please interrupt me. Please enter your own ideas in the chat. I'm curious to hear what you have to say. But here in the United States, mental and cognitive disabilities are often identified in schools. People get documentation in schools based on evaluations. But here in the United States, school funding is determined by local property taxes, which means that in poorer communities, in towns where there is not a lot of wealth, people don't live in big houses, people live in small houses, and because they live in small houses, they pay very low property taxes. Because those property taxes fund education, those school districts don't have very much money. Whereas in wealthy neighborhoods where people live in large houses, they pay higher property taxes, higher taxes on the larger houses. Those higher property taxes fund better schools, and those schools have more resources, have more money. So because disability is often identified in schools, yes, and I see a comment. We see this in almost every country, and not just India and the United States. Yes, exactly. I'm talking about India and the United States specifically because these are the two countries where I've specifically researched disability rights laws. But everywhere in the world, exactly, everywhere in the world, disability and ableism present problems because there's no country that has an infrastructure that's completely accessible. So excellent point there. Thank you. So the way that disability is identified in the United States in schools means that in wealthy schools, they can hire people to do evaluations to correctly identify disabilities among students. And once someone in school has documentation for their disability, then later on as an adult, they can use that documentation that they got in school, that they got from the evaluations, to ask for accommodations, to ask for workplace accommodations, to ask for legal accommodations, to state, I have a disability and these are my needs as a person with a disability. In schools that don't have as much money, it is up to teachers and parents, and the teachers often have large classes, more than 30 students. If they have dozens of students, how are they going to identify individual students' needs? Do you think it'll be as easy to do that correctly? And so students in poorer schools often don't get the right disability identification. If they're identified as having a disability, it's often not the correct identification. They're identified as having a disability, but not the disability type that they actually have. So how much money a person's family has, but also how much money the community has because of how funding works, those determine how a person's disability is recognized. And if you have a disability that is well documented, then it's so much easier to get the accommodations that you need. And if you're involved in the criminal legal system, if you are caught doing something illegal, or if someone thinks that you've done something illegal, if you have the documentation in detail that describes what your disability is, you're much more likely to get the legal accommodations to help you to navigate the legal system. So one great barrier to fairness within the criminal legal system is the fact that disability identification is not accessible to many people anywhere. So this is one area where people working in law must work with people working in psychology, people working in neuroscience, to make sure that law, the fields of law and the fields of psychology, neuroscience, the people who are doing the evaluations to identify disabilities, to make sure that they're sharing resources with one another, to make sure there's a strong partnership between those whose job it is to identify disabilities among populations and those whose job it is to enforce laws. Does that make sense? Do you have questions? Do you have examples? I have an example from the United States. It's a very sad example. There was a 15-year-old boy in my hometown. He was African American. He was black-skinned. And in school at 15, he was caught walking into the wrong classroom. He walked into the wrong classroom, and the substitute teacher, so it wasn't the regular teacher, it was a substitute teacher. The substitute teacher thought that this stranger walking into the classroom was imposing a threat. So the substitute teacher put his hands on the boy's arms, on the boy's wrists, and held the boy's wrists to restrain him because he thought, oh, this teenage boy walking into the classroom, he's a threat. So when he restrained the boy, this teenage boy reacted violently because he has a cognitive disability that makes it hard for him to regulate his emotions. And so when someone lays their hands on him, he has a violent reaction. He has a violent response. It's his impulse. It's part of his disability. How do you think the legal system should have responded to that? This boy has a documented disability, but the substitute teacher didn't read that. Well, what I think should have been done, what I think the United States, the United Nations, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, if the UN CRPD was being applied, then after that happened, the question would have gone to the school, well, how were you accommodating or not accommodating this boy's disability? Why was he left to roam around the hallways by himself alone so he could wander into the wrong classroom? And why did the substitute teacher think it was okay to lay his hands on this boy, which triggered the boy's response? A rights-based system would have responded like that. But what actually happened was that this teenage boy was locked up for a year. Locked up for a year because he had a violent altercation with a substitute teacher who put his hands on him first and didn't take his disability into consideration. So this is one way in which ableism was compounded by racism here in the United States. But I know that, in India and that everywhere in the world, racism, casteism, ethnocentrism play a role. And that if this substitute teacher had seen a person from a more privileged social group exhibiting the same behaviors based on disability, the response would not have been the same. This substitute teacher would not have grabbed the boy's wrists. So it's very important to not just look at a person's disability, but look at how this person's disability interacts with other parts of their identity. And with that, we'll introduce critical race theory. Has anyone here heard of critical race theory? So this was a term that was coined in the United States in the late 1980s, so over 30 years ago. And it's a study, it's a legal area. It's a legal, legal studies of the ways in which the laws and the systems themselves are racist. So it's not just the individuals, it's not just the judges, it's not just the lawyers who are racist, but the laws themselves have racism entrenched within them. So in India, I know that, religion and caste are entrenched within the laws, and that there's constantly changes happening to make sure that the laws are as fair as possible. I'm going to cite Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw and Richard Delgado are two of the founders of critical race theory, but Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality as part of critical race theory. And intersectionality is a very important concept in disability studies because intersectionality describes how identity-based oppressions are compounded by one another. So there's racism and there's ableism. Do they exist separately, or do they bolster each other? Well, critical race theory and intersectionality say that racism and ableism function together, that they are entwined with one another. So ableism makes racism worse, and racism makes ableism worse. Now, that's critical race theory broadly, but there's another area called Discrete. And this is a very new field of academic discourse, combining disability studies with critical race theory. So it's taking critical race theory, this idea, this concept that racism is ingrained in the laws and it's ingrained in the systems, and it's not enough to look at human behavior as racist. It's important to look at how the laws themselves are racist and the systems themselves are racist. And there's an Indian woman in the United States named Dr. Subini Ansianama, and she's one of the founders of the field of Discrete. So I recommend, if you're interested, looking up her work. I think she's brilliant. I've attended a conference to hear her speak. She's wonderful. Her one of her most recent books is The Pedagogy of Pathologization, but she's one of the mothers of Discrete, disability critical race theory. So this field of theory, this field of research, is looking into how racism in laws and policies make ableism worse. How people with disabilities with darker skin are affected by the intersections of racism and ableism together. So I very much recommend this field of Discrete. But Discrete is the main field that I'm drawing from when I talk about these things. When I talk about these intersections, I want to cite that this is coming from Discrete. This is coming from Dr. Subini Ansianama. So I have a few discussion questions for you. Feel free to answer them if you feel like entering something in the chat, or think about them later on. They can just be rhetorical questions. You can answer them right now. You can think about them later. But first, how can legal systems better protect people with disabilities from becoming incarcerated? How do social identity factors such as ethnicity, religion, caste, gender identity, etc., influence whether and how a person is identified as disabled by the criminal legal system? And finally, what role does the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities play in protecting people with disabilities from becoming incarcerated? Yes. Okay. Whether discrete theory and critical race theory is applicable in India. I'm going to turn that back to you. Do you think it's applicable in India?
Sorry, ma'am, your question was not clear.
So, Dr. Beg asked whether discrete theory and critical race theory is applicable in India. And I'm turning that question back around and asking, do you think, or how do you think discrete theory or critical race theory are applicable in India? So the founder of Discrete theory, Dr. Subini Ansi Anama, she's an Indian woman living in the United States. So because she's living in the United States, teaching at Stanford, because she's teaching at a US university, she writes in terms of US policies. However, as an Indian woman, she also cites Indian examples. So in the United States, it's often an issue of people whose skin is black, people whose skin is white, people who have Latin American ancestry. Often those are the racial and ethnic categories that make that systems respond to differently when it comes to disability. But in India, what identities do you think systems respond to differently when it comes to disability? Do you think that a Hindu Muslim, sorry, do you think that a Hindu person and a Muslim person exhibiting the same disability characteristics, do you think that the legal system will respond to the two of them in the same way? Do you think that a person of higher caste and a person with lower caste, historically, do you think that the legal system would respond to them in the same way? So what social characteristics in India do you think are relevant in the same way that race is relevant in the United States to how the legal system responds to disability and categorizes disability? That's a question for you. It's definitely relevant. But how is it relevant? Well, I want you to think about that because it was a very good question, but it's not one that I'm going to answer for you. But first, how can the legal system better protect people with disabilities from becoming incarcerated? Well, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has a clause on legal capacity. Legal capacity is the right for people with disabilities to have agency under the law, to be able to make decisions for themselves instead of having others make all of their decisions for them, instead of having others step in and determine their outcome without asking them. So, how do you think the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities can be used, can be interpreted to prevent people with disabilities from becoming incarcerated? And how, for example, I'll just use one social identity factor from this list. What about gender identity? What about a person who is cisgender versus a person who is transgender? Whom do you think the legal system is going to want to support more? Both are disabled. The cisgender person is disabled and the transgender person is disabled. Whose disability do you think the criminal legal system is going to accommodate more willingly? The cisgender person or the transgender person? So these are some areas where the UNCRPD plays a role. The UNCRPD is addressing these. So more than in domestic laws, more than in US domestic law, more than in India's domestic laws, more than in most countries around the world in their national domestic laws, the UN's Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability takes these intersectionalities into consideration, takes the ways in which a person's caste, a person's race, and the racism and the sexism and the ethnocentrism, how those interact with ableism in determining a person's disability experience and determining a person's disability outlook. So one very clear solution is to fully incorporate the UN CRPD, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, into domestic laws to make sure that we're following the UN CRPD, to make sure that when it comes to looking at domestic laws and how disabilities are defined under domestic laws or the UN CRPD, look to the UN CRPD because this UN convention fully acknowledges the intersectionalities in ways that many domestic laws don't. The UN CRPD, it's still developing, so there's still room to improve it. There's still room to bring these intersectionalities into it more so that we can understand more fully how racism, how casteism, how ethnocentrism, how these affect the disability experience, how these lead people with disabilities to become incarcerated at higher rates. It's not just the disabilities, it's not just the ableism, but it's the ways in which the criminal legal system responds to a person's disability and her race, a person's disability and her caste, a person with disabilities and her skin tone, and her religion. So it's very important to take a person's whole identity into consideration, look at how multiple marginalized identities make a situation what it is for someone. So the UNCRPD plays the role in acknowledging these intersectionalities, and we need to bring that more into domestic legal practices. To better protect people with disabilities from becoming incarcerated, we need to first recognize and accommodate the disabilities from early on, even if a person does not have the documentation, because often that documentation, the paperwork, the forms that say, this is my disability, those are sometimes hard to access. They can be very expensive. They can be, the professionals who do the evaluations, those people are not always plentiful in some regions. And so not everyone has access to the evaluations to get the documentation that they need, to get the disability accommodations that they need. So systems in schools, in workplaces, and in the law, in the legal system, must provide accommodation regardless of documentation. But then, even after a person has been identified as needing accommodations, even after a person has been identified as having a disability, it's also important to understand how disability interacts with that person's other social identity factors. So, thank you very much. I'm wrapping up the presentation here, but do you have any more questions? Do you have any more comments? Is there anything else that we didn't get to or that was unclear before we finish?
Thank you, Anna. A very nice and interactive session. Hopefully, the people are benefited with it. And there are certain questions which have been put forth, but they might be a repetition of your entire discussion. But I am again, then also I am putting forth the questions before you.
Okay.
There's a question before you. I would be framing it in the form of a question. It's rather a statement made that whether a physical, mental, cognitive, or developmental condition would limit a person's ability to engage in certain tasks.
I think this question came up earlier. I think this question was asked earlier on in the presentation. Is that true?
Yeah, it was a
Yeah,
repetition, but since there are people who have joined later on, so therefore I have
I
just
see.
put forth the.
I see. Yes, yes. Okay. And to that question I respond, yes, to an extent, but it's not just that person's condition. According to the human rights model, according to the UNCRPD, it's the person's physical or mental, cognitive sense or sensory condition, plus the world around that person, the built environment that limits that person. Because without an inaccessible environment, would a person be disabled? So it's very important to acknowledge that it's the person's condition, but it's also the environment and the infrastructure surrounding that person that creates the disability. So without an inaccessible environment, a person would not be as disabled. But with an inaccessible environment, a person can be more disabled. So it's the combination of a person's physical, mental, sensory condition and the built environment around that person. And I've entered my email address into the chat. So please, if you have follow-up questions later on, um, feel welcome to contact me. I would love to have further discussions with any of you. The questions that have been asked so far have been very interesting. Are there more questions before we finish?
No, Anna, I suppose that would be enough for the questions up till now. But yes, I would be asking the entire organizing team if they are having any further questions with pertaining to the laws or anything as of the comparative analysis of the India and the US laws. Then they would be putting forth the questions via email or any other mode, if whatever is preferable for you. They would be putting forth before you the questions later on after the session. Fine.
Okay.
Now, to render a generous vote of thanks, I would like to invite Dr. Geetu Singh to please propose a vote of thanks for the present technical session.
Thank you.
Thank you, Seema ma'am. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to extend the vote of thanks. I would take this opportunity to thank Ms. Anna Clement for such a wonderful, interactive, and a comparative study, which has put forth the basic issues which is relating to the survey and statistics of disability, and how the law of both the countries are different. Yet there are certain lacunas in the law, which has been very well highlighted by Anna. And we are fortunate enough, Anna, to have you with us for deliberating on such a sensitive and important issue, which is mostly overlooked and overshadowed by other issues. So thank you for sparing your precious time from the busy schedule and sharing with us your experience, your examples. They were all very good. Thank you so much for such a wonderful deliberations. We would be looking forward to hear much from you in many other sessions. Thank you so much, the whole entire team, for organizing such an interactive and wonderful session. With this, I would like to thank the whole organizing team and the resource person for being with us. Looking forward for the next session, and with the best wishes for your other sessions, I would like to take a leave. Thank you.
Thank you, Geetu ma'am. And thank you, Anna. So now we will be ending the broadcast. Thank you. Thank you for your association.
Thank you.